They say heaven borrowed his voice. But if you knew the exact coordinates of the basement where that sound was born, you'd never call it heaven again. You'd call it a crime scene. Imagine a house at 17520 Santa Rosa Drive on the east side of Detroit. From the sidewalk, it looks like a typical brick residence of the 1950s, sturdy, respectable, ordinary. But behind those walls, the air was thick with a toxic cocktail of cheap whiskey, religious fervor, and a vibrating, invisible fear. This was the laboratory of a monster. Bobby DeBarge, the eldest of 10 children, didn't learn to sing for the applause or the dream of Motown. He learned to sing because it was the only psychological retreat his father's fists couldn't reach. In that house, music wasn't art, it was an exit strategy. Bobby was a biracial anomaly in a city defined by hard lines. His father, Robert DeBarge Sr., was a white soldier with a temper that could split glass. His mother, Ederline, was a black woman of deep faith who held her 10 children together with hymns and hope even as her own spirit was being systematically dismantled. The investigation into the DeBarge family dossier reveals a household ruled by the General, a man who viewed his children not as flesh and blood, but as targets for a predatory rage. Bobby, the firstborn, carried the heaviest cross. The forensic reality of his childhood is a harrowing account of systemic physical and sexual abuse, a trauma so absolute it shattered his identity before he ever reached puberty. But here is the profound forensic mystery of Bobby DeBarge. How does a soul living in a state of constant siege produce a sound so divine? Music became Bobby's tactical disassociation. When the house filled with his father's violence, Bobby would retreat into what he called the high space. He discovered that he possessed a falsetto so pure, so impossibly thin and resilient, that it sounded like polished glass vibrating in the wind. This wasn't just singing, it was a switch in consciousness. He realized that if he could hit a note high enough, if he could sustain a frequency that transcended the human range, he wasn't a bruised boy in a basement anymore. He was a frequency. He was light. He was untouchable. On Sunday mornings, the neighbors on Santa Rosa Drive would stop on the sidewalk, mesmerized by the 4-part harmonies drifting through the windows. They called it the gospel touch. They had no idea they were listening to a collective survival mechanism. Those perfect, angelic chords were stitched together from broken ribs and midnight screams. Bobby was the architect of this harmony. He realized early on that his voice was a shield. He believed that if he sang perfectly, if the melody was sweet enough, perhaps the monster would be pacified. If the song was flawless, maybe the whiskey wouldn't turn into blood that night. But as any investigator of generational trauma will tell you, a shield can only hold for so long before it becomes a cage. Bobby was singing his way out of hell, but he was carrying the embers of that fire inside his throat. He was heading for the bright lights of Los Angeles and the platinum records of Switch, but the boy from the basement was still hiding in the shadows of his own voice. He was about to become a superstar, but he was carrying a secret that no amount of fame could ever fully drown out. He was the golden boy of Motown, but in the quiet moments between the takes, he was still just a child waiting for the screaming to stop. By the early 1970s, Detroit was a city of gears and ghosts. For Bobby DeBarge and his brother Tommy, the Motor City was a cage whose bars were starting to rattle with the weight of their ambition. They were teenagers now, possessed of a musical vocabulary that was so refined it felt alien to the rough-and-tumble East Side. They began gigging in local clubs, playing sophisticated soul that required a level of precision most grown men couldn't master. But as the investigation into Bobby's early adulthood shows, he wasn't just looking for a career, he was looking for an anesthetic. He was looking for a way to stop being the boy from Santa Rosa Drive. In 1975, the dream finally flickered to life. Bobby was hired to play piano for the legendary Walrus of Love, Barry White. It was the ultimate validation for a 20-year-old kid from Detroit. For a brief window, it seemed the General's shadow had finally been outrun. Bobby was on the big stage, surrounded by luxury and professional respect. But when Barry White decided to go solo with a different orchestral arrangement, the gig evaporated overnight. Bobby was sent back to Detroit with nothing but a taste of the high life and a soul-crushing sense of rejection. This is the fracture point in the DeBarge dossier. In the world of trauma investigation, we look for the moment when a victim's resilience fails. When Bobby returned to the gray streets of Detroit, he didn't return to a home. He returned to a site of unsolved pain. Heroin found him in the wreckage of that failed Barry White tour. It was the perfect predator. Forensically, we have to examine the chemistry of his choice. Most artists, in the 1,970 seconds, were fueled by cocaine, a stimulant that provides a sense of power, ego, and invincibility. But Bobby didn't want power. He wanted to disappear. Heroin is a central nervous system depressant that acts on the mu-opioid receptors, creating a profound sense of detachment. It mimicked the high space of his falsetto, providing a warm, chemical blanket that muffled the psychic screams of his childhood. It wasn't a party drug. It was a heroin hush. It allowed him to sit in a room and feel nothing, which, to Bobby, was the ultimate luxury. While his contemporaries were migrating to Los Angeles to sign with labels and chase the sunset, Bobby stayed in Detroit, chained to a needle. For nearly 2 years, he lived in a narcotics haze, his genius rotting in the dark. He was a platinum voice living on a copper budget, drifting through the city like a specter. But the music, that relentless gift, refused to let him die in obscurity. The turning point came via a frantic phone call from an old bandmate, Greg Williams. "Motown is calling, Bobby. Jermaine Jackson has seen the demo. They want the group. But you have to get clean, or you're dead to the industry." The investigation into Bobby's recovery is one of the most harrowing chapters in the history of R&B. Bobby didn't have access to a luxury rehab or a methadone clinic. He committed himself to a cold turkey detox in a locked room. The witnesses to this period describe a man vibrating with such intensity that his teeth were audible. He underwent the full, violent spectrum of withdrawal, the bone-deep aches, the hallucinations, the cold sweats that soaked through his mattress. He was sweating out more than just drugs. He was sweating out the Detroit streets, the whiskey breath of his father, and the layers of shame he had accumulated. He was driven by a desperate, singular realization. His voice was the only thing that could negotiate his release from hell. When Bobby finally stepped onto the plane for Los Angeles in 1977, he was a ghost of a man. He was painfully thin, his hands still carried a subtle tremor, and his skin had a sallow, gray cast that no stage makeup could truly hide. But when he walked into the Motown offices on Sunset Boulevard and sat down at a grand piano, the silk returned. He hit a note so clear, so divorced from the grime of his recent past, that Berry Gordy reportedly stopped his meeting just to listen. Bobby had won. He was the frontman of a new powerhouse group called Switch. He was the new golden boy of the most prestigious black label on earth. He had the suits, the lights, and the platinum promise. But as we move into the next phase of this investigation, we must ask the question that haunts every survivor. You can take the man out of Detroit, but how do you take the Detroit out of the man? When Bobby DeBarge landed in Los Angeles in the late 1,970 seconds, he stepped into a Motown that was searching for a new identity. The Jackson 5 had matured and moved on, and Berry Gordy was hungry for a sound that could bridge the gap between street corner soul and high-end disco. Bobby didn't just meet that need, he redefined it. The group was called Switch, a name chosen because every member could switch instruments and lead vocals mid-performance. They were the ultimate musical Swiss Army knife, but Bobby was the diamond-tipped blade. The investigation into the 1,978 self-titled debut album, Switch, reveals a production that was light years ahead of its time. Bobby wasn't just singing, he was arranging, producing, and playing multiple instruments. He brought a Detroit grit to the L.A. sheen. When There'll Never Be hit the airwaves, it didn't just climb the charts, it haunted them. It reached the top 10 on the R&B charts and went platinum, cementing Bobby as the premier falsetto of his generation. To the public, Bobby was the quintessential star. He had the golden brown hair, the perfect biracial crossover look, and a voice that seemed to vibrate with a celestial tenderness. Women wrote letters to Motown claiming the song played at their weddings. Men spent hours in their cars trying to replicate the impossibly high bridge of the track. But for the investigator, we have to look behind the platinum plaques. Bobby was singing about love and tenderness, concepts he had never actually experienced in a healthy form. He was selling a dream to the world that he himself was barred from entering. In 1979, the momentum continued with Switch 2. The track, I Call Your Name, became an anthem. Rumors swirled in the industry that Bobby had written the song for LaToya Jackson, his high-profile girlfriend at the time. Their relationship was a collision of two dynasties, the Jacksons and the DeBarges. To the outside world, they were the golden couple. But the forensic reality of Bobby's life during this peak was one of mounting internal pressure. The heroin hush we discussed in Part 2 was no longer a secret. It was a ghost in the dressing room. Despite the fame, Bobby's hands still carried the tremors of his Detroit past. The investigation reveals that the fame he had chased so desperately was now acting as a magnifying glass for his insecurities. He began to disappear for hours before sound checks. He was often unreachable, even when he was in the room. He told a friend during this time, "The higher I sing, the more I feel like I'm leaving the ground, and I'm terrified of what happens when I land." By the end of 1980, Switch was R&B royalty, having sold millions of records and influenced every boy band that would follow, from New Edition to Guy. But inside Motown, the gears were shifting. The label was looking at Bobby's younger brothers Elle, Randy, and James, who were coming up as the group DeBarge. Bobby was the architect of their sound. He taught them the harmonies, the discipline, and the silk. But in a move that would prove to be his psychological undoing, he decided to leave Switch to help launch his brother's career, believing he would be the leader of the family dynasty. He didn't realize that the silk was about to be snagged on the jagged edges of contracts and legal red tape. He was the one who built the door, but as we move into Part 4, we see that Bobby DeBarge was the only one left standing on the outside as the world walked through. By 1981, Bobby DeBarge stood at a crossroads that would determine the tragic trajectory of his remaining years. He was the undisputed frontman of Switch, a platinum-selling artist and a household name. Yet, the investigation into his internal state reveals a man pulled by a powerful, almost religious sense of family duty. In the DeBarge household, the siblings weren't just relatives. They were fellow veterans of the General's War on Santa Rosa Drive. Bobby, the eldest, felt a profound, sacrificial responsibility to pull his younger siblings Elle, Randy, Mark, Bunny, and James out of the Detroit shadows and into the California sun. He made a fateful, selfless decision. He would walk away from Switch at the absolute height of their commercial success. He believed that by merging his established genius with his siblings' untapped potential to form the group DeBarge, he could create a permanent financial and emotional sanctuary for his entire family. He spent months in the recording studio acting as the primary architect of the DeBarge sound. He was more than a brother. He was a drill sergeant of harmony. He was the one who taught Elle the precise breath control needed for a sustained falsetto. He was the one who structured the complex, multi-layered vocal stacks that would become the family's trademark. He was the bridge between the gritty, soulful tradition of 70 Seconds, Detroit, and the polished, radio-friendly R&B that Motown demanded for the new decade. However, the forensic trail of the music industry shows that loyalty is rarely a protected asset in a corporate contract. When the group DeBarge finally signed their blockbuster deal with Motown, Bobby found himself caught in a devastating legal and personal snare. Because of his existing, unresolved solo and group contracts from his years with Switch and Gordy Records, he was legally prohibited from appearing on the early DeBarge album covers, performing in their high-budget music videos, or even being credited as a primary member. He was the man who built the house from the foundation up, but the legal gates were slammed shut before he could walk through the front door. While the younger DeBarges were appearing on Soul Train and dominating the Billboard charts with hits like All This Love and I Like It, Bobby was forced into the shadows. He became a ghost in the machine, a silent producer, an uncredited writer, and a private vocal coach for his own brothers. The psychological toll of this forced invisibility was immense. He sat in the back of the control room, watching his younger brother L become the new face of the dynasty, the new golden boy of Berry Gordy's empire. While Bobby was undeniably proud of his brothers, the investigation reveals he was also being profoundly hollowed out. He had traded his individual crown for a family throne, only to find himself sitting on the floor in the dark. This state of erasure triggered the inevitable return of the only thing that could kill the sting of being forgotten, the heroin hush. The investigation reveals that Bobby's drug use didn't just resume, it accelerated into a desperate spiral during these years of silent production. If he couldn't be the star on the stage, he would be the king of the motel room. He began to cycle through periods of extreme, frantic creativity, followed by weeks of total, terrifying disappearance. To the industry, he was becoming difficult. To his family, he was becoming a liability. He was a man who felt he had been systematically written out of his own life story by the very people he had tried to save. By the mid-1980s, the group DeBarge was a global phenomenon, but the trauma they had collectively escaped in Detroit was finally catching up to the entire family structure. The pressure of fame was acting as a catalyst for the dormant pain of their childhood. But Bobby, as the eldest and the one who had carried the most weight for the longest time, was the first to truly buckle. Motown eventually severed ties with him, citing unreliability and unresolvable legal entanglements. With no label, no group, and his family's fame now completely eclipsing his own, Bobby DeBarge retreated. He turned his back on the lights of Hollywood and returned to the only place that had ever truly claimed him, the gray, unforgiving streets of Michigan. He didn't realize that by returning home, he was walking into a final, lethal trap. He was heading toward a motel room raid in Grand Rapids that would lead to a 5-year prison sentence, a sentence that would not only silence his voice, but would introduce a virus into his blood that would ensure the music ended far too soon. By 1988, the silk had been thoroughly snagged on the jagged edges of a Michigan winter. Bobby DeBarge, the man who had once been the aesthetic and musical heartbeat of Motown, was now a ghost in his own hometown of Grand Rapids. The investigation into his return to Michigan reveals a man who had lost his creative anchor. Without the structure of a recording contract or the buffer of his family's superstardom, Bobby's heroin hush became his only constant reality. He was no longer a superstar in hiding. He was a high-profile target in a city that had no room for fallen idols. The fracture point occurred in a nondescript motel room that smelled of stale cigarettes and desperation. In a coordinated raid by the Grand Rapids police, Bobby and his younger brother Chico were arrested for possession and conspiracy to distribute controlled substances. The headlines were merciless, dripping with the schadenfreude that often accompanies the fall of a dynasty. The falsetto king was now a drug trafficker, while Chico's involvement was largely seen as the folly of youth and bad association. Bobby, as the elder brother and the man the law viewed as a repeat offender, was processed through a much harsher forensic lens. The judge was not interested in his platinum records or his contributions to American soul. Bobby was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. The investigation into Bobby's years behind bars, from 1988 to 1993, is a descent into a specific kind of American hell designed to strip away the silk for a man like Bobby, biracial, sensitive, and possessed of a soft beauty that had been his commercial trademark. The prison environment was a predatory landscape that mirrored the violence of his father's house. He was no longer a platinum artist. He was a number in a sea of blue denim. The silence was the most brutal part of the sentence. In prison, there are no microphones to catch your vulnerability, no audiences to validate your pain, and no high space to retreat to. There is only the rhythmic noise of the tear and the internal screaming of a trauma that had never been allowed to heal. It was during these 5 years that the most devastating event of Bobby's life occurred, a trauma that would not be confirmed until years later. The forensic trail and subsequent family testimonies suggest that Bobby did not contract HIV through a shared needle, as the public cruelly assumed, but through the systemic violence and lack of protection within the prison system itself. In the brutal, hyper-masculine hierarchy of the yard, Bobby's pretty features and his history as a victim of childhood abuse made him a target for the same type of predators he had spent his life trying to outrun. He was a man who had spent his career trying to sing his way out of a basement, only to find himself locked in a concrete cage where his voice was a liability, not an asset. While Bobby was silenced by iron bars, the world outside was moving on with brutal efficiency. The lush 1,982nd soul he helped pioneer was being replaced by the harder digital edge of New Jack Swing and the rise of hip-hop. Even his brother's group, DeBarge, was fracturing under the same weight of generational trauma and addiction that had claimed him. By the time Bobby was released in 1993, he wasn't just a has-been. He was a relic of a lost era. He walked out of the prison gates, a free man on paper, but he carried a terminal secret in his blood, a virus that was already beginning to dismantle the very body that had housed the most beautiful voice in Detroit. He was 37 years old, thin as a rail, and his skin had lost the golden, radiant glow of his Motown years. He had 5 years of silence to make up for, but as we move into the final chapters of this investigation, we realize that for Bobby DeBarge, time was no longer a luxury he could afford. The song was reaching its final, dissonant bridge, and the silk was thinner than it had ever been. When Bobby DeBarge walked through the prison gates in 1993, he didn't return to a hero's welcome or a standing ovation. He returned to a world that had not only moved on but had effectively erased his contributions from the cultural hard drive. The investigation into his final 2 years reveals a man living in a state of total biological and professional eviction. He was a 37-year-old veteran of a generational war that most people had forgotten, and he was carrying a diagnosis that, in the early 1990 seconds, was treated as both a social and a physical death sentence. The forensic reality of Bobby's health was deteriorating with terrifying speed. The HIV virus, which had likely gone untreated and unmanaged during his 5 years of incarceration, had transitioned into full-blown AIDS. His immune system was a ghost, unable to fight off the opportunistic infections that began to dismantle his body from the inside out. Yet, the most haunting part of this investigation is Bobby's absolute refusal to surrender to the silence. He didn't want his final legacy to be that of a drug trafficker or a prisoner. He wanted to die as a musician. He spent his meager remaining savings money scraped together from the few royalties he still received on small blocks of studio time in Michigan and California. He was desperate to capture the dying notes of his soul before the tape ran out. Witnesses who were present in those final recording sessions describe a scene that borders on the hallowed. Bobby was so emaciated that his vintage stage suits hung off his frame like rags on a wire hanger. He was plagued by debilitating night sweats, fevers, and chronic fatigue that made standing up an act of extreme will. He would often need to sleep for 2 or 3 hours on a studio couch just to find the strength to record a single verse. But when the red recording light flickered on, something miraculous, something almost forensic in its defiance occurred. The silk returned. But it was a different kind of silk now. It was no longer the polished, seductive falsetto of his switch years, designed to sell records and melt hearts. It was a voice that sounded like it had been pulled through a furnace, raspy, vulnerable, and terrifyingly honest. The investigation into these final tapes, eventually released as the album It's Not Over, shows a man who had finally stopped performing for the charts and started singing for his soul. He wasn't singing about love as a pop concept anymore. He was singing about the jagged reality of forgiveness, forgiving himself, his family, and even the general who had started this cycle of pain decades ago. The investigation into the music industry's response during this twilight period reveals a cold, clinical stigma. The same labels and executives who had once fought over his signature now refused to even take his calls. The Jackson and DeBarge names, which should have been his protection, were struggling with their own massive scandals and financial collapses, leaving Bobby in a state of terrifying isolation. He was an untouchable in the industry he helped build. He told a family member during this time, "I've spent my entire life being loved for the sound I make, but now that I finally have something real to say, no one wants to hear it because they're afraid of how I'm dying. This is the ultimate indictment of the Motown dream. You are only valuable as long as your trauma can be packaged as a pretty, marketable sound. As his physical frame began to finally collapse under the weight of the virus, Bobby returned to his mother's house in Michigan. Etterline, Mama DeBarge, became his primary caregiver, bringing the story back to the very beginning. The investigation of his final months shows a man who finally faced the ghost of his father not with fear, but with a weary, terminal peace. Bobby spent his last weeks at the hospice of Greater Grand Rapids. He was no longer a superstar, no longer a felon, and no longer a legend. He was just a son trying to find his way back to the high space one last time. In his final days, the fevers took his mind, but his fingers still moved rhythmically on the hospital bedsheets as if he were playing a phantom piano. On the 16th of August 1995, the song finally ended. Bobby DeBarge passed away at the age of 39. The news of his death was a mere blip in the 1,990 seconds media cycle, largely overshadowed by the louder, more sensational scandals of the decade. But for those who understood the physics of soul, a fundamental frequency had disappeared from the universe. He had finished his work. He had sung his way through hell and back, leaving behind a trail of silk that led all the way to the edge of the light. When Bobby DeBarge died in 1995, the silence that followed was deafening. There were no grand television tributes, no star-studded funerals, and no immediate retrospectives in the music press. The investigation into the years immediately following his death reveals a period of cultural amnesia. Bobby had died of a stigmatized disease, carrying the label of a convicted felon, and the industry he helped build seemed content to let his story fade into a footnote. But music possesses a forensic persistence that even death cannot dismantle. You cannot erase a frequency once it has been released into the atmosphere. The investigation into the 21st century R&B renaissance shows that Bobby DeBarge's DNA is everywhere. Every time a modern artist like Usher, Maxwell, or D'Angelo reaches for a falsetto that combines masculine power with a raw, exposed vulnerability, they are channeling the ghost of the Santa Rosa basement. The silk did not die in that Grand Rapids hospice. It evolved. The DeBarge sound, that specific, airy, multi-layered vocal stack, became the blueprint for the neo-soul movement and the boy band explosion of the late 90 seconds. But the true legacy of Bobby DeBarge isn't just found in the notes, it's found in the narrative. In 2019, nearly a quarter century after his passing, the release of the Bobby DeBarge story on TV1 signaled a massive shift in public perception. The investigation into the audience's reaction reveals a profound, collective reckoning. For the first time, the world saw the monster in the house, the systemic abuse that necessitated the addiction. The public stopped looking at Bobby as a fallen star and started seeing him as a survivor who used his talent to hold back the dark for as long as he humanly could. As we look at the surviving members of the DeBarge family today, we see the price of that legacy. Many of the siblings struggled with the same demons, the same heroin hush that claimed Bobby. But because Bobby went first, because he carried the heaviest cross as the eldest son, he provided a roadmap for their eventual recovery. He was the angel in hell who taught his brothers and sisters that even in the midst of fire, you can still produce harmony. The investigation concludes that Bobby DeBarge was a martyr for the family name, a man who burned himself out so that the rest of the dynasty could have a chance to shine. The final verdict on this case is one of tragic triumph. Bobby DeBarge was a man born into a world that wanted to break him, and in many ways, it succeeded. It broke his body, it broke his reputation, and it broke his heart. But it could never break his frequency. He proved that the human voice is the only thing capable of traveling between heaven and hell without losing its soul. He was the man who sang his way out of the basement, and even when he couldn't make it all the way out, he left the door open for everyone else. As we turn off the lights on this dossier, the final image isn't the prison bars or the hospital bed. It's a young Bobby at the piano in Detroit, his eyes closed, his fingers dancing across the keys, hitting a note so high and so pure that for one brief, shimmering second, the general is silent. The whiskey is gone. The fear is vanished. In that note, Bobby DeBarge is finally free. The case of Bobby DeBarge is officially closed, but the silk remains.